Magdalena Sorilla, and I'm a research assistant at the Emerging Markets Institute at the Cornell S.E. Johnson College of Business. Today, we will be discussing how the current political landscape is affecting the emerging markets economies. Today, our guests are Ross Brown, MBA second-year student, Professor Lourdes Casanova, Director of the Emerging Markets, and Professor Andrew Karolyi, Dean of Faculty and co-founder of the Emerging Markets Institute.
Thank you, Magdalena. And thank you, Professor Karolyi and Ross, for joining us today. So the question is, the economic landscape seems to be moving. Now is the annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank in Washington. We seem to be moving with Brexit, with maybe the new US administration, to a more protectionist economic model. You have written extensively a very successful book on emerging markets. How do you think these changes are affecting emerging markets?
A lot is the short answer, Lourdes. I know that the irony of our talking today on the same day as we're having meetings in Washington, IMF and World Bank, where every corridor is talking about this very issue. What is the economic fallout for our brothers and sisters in emerging markets from the actions that are being taken in this country, the political environment shift in this country and in Europe a lot. It's important, I think, to disentangle the potential consequences in terms of trying to understand what the mandates are in these countries. And the mandates are clear by listening to the political campaigns that are driving them, not only in this country, but in France and in other parts of Europe as well, Brexit, the UK. The drive to nationalism has direct consequences for the real sector in terms of trade flows, right? So thinking about countries that have exposure in the emerging markets, countries that have real exposures to these countries that are seeing these shifts in the political landscape, those that have large export-driven exposures to the United States, to the UK, to Europe. This is a logical place. Another place to be looking at is, a big promise, and certainly in the campaign in this country, was in terms of infrastructure spending. We haven't seen it yet, but we know it's coming. Upwards, they say, of $1 trillion infrastructure spend. How will this matter for different countries around the emerging markets in terms of the adverse consequences of what that means for labor flows into this country? Our friends in Mexico, for example, are likely to be a direct exposure to that. And then I was also going to talk about not only sort of the trade flows and the labor flows, but also monetary policy. As we go into this next phase of nationalization, or refocusing on America and in other countries like in the UK, this has consequences for monetary policy and the actions of the monetary policy authorities in terms of renormalizing from the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Now that matters because it impacts the capital flows. Capital flows are now, we're suffering for the emerging markets for almost like 2 or 3 years. We saw a steady decline in net new capital flows into these emerging markets, and this can represent huge destabilizing influences for the real sector, for the labor market sector. So I'm talking as an economist. I know you want to think about this from a bigger perspective, but I thought I would share that. If you're talking about specific countries, obviously we talk about from the labor market side. Mexico is a direct impact. We know that there's a lot of talk in Mexico. You were there recently. I was there recently. The conversation flows naturally there from our friends down there. In terms of the real sector, we have tremendous exposures for much of LATAM and also much of the Asia Pacific in terms of the emerging Asia Pacific for the US. And then as far as monetary policy, this is almost like a universal touch. It's almost like all emerging markets suffer from the swoon of the shifts in monetary policy towards raising interest rates and repatriating of capital flows back home to the United States or back to Europe. That's hurting emerging markets. So that's sort of an overview.
Thank you very much. Just one more thing. I was reading with these annual meetings that it would seem that very lately that capital flows are going back to emerging markets.
The irony.
The irony. How do you see that? Is this maybe a perception that risk is now everywhere, that the stock markets maybe in the US are over the top? So how do you see that? It's of course too early to read too much into that.
But you're absolutely right. That's the paradox of this is in the last 3 months probably you've actually seen a kind of an uptick back in terms of capital flows. And you're tempted to go back to my story about monetary policy. You could spin that by saying, well, you know, they're normalizing monetary policy in the United States and in the European Central Bank, but maybe not at the paces at which they thought they might. And so the return of capital towards higher yields back in the United States may not be as strong as it once was. There's another layer, which is we had, if you recall, I know you know well, we all know well, there was this tremendous post-Trump bump in equity valuations. And what has happened in the last 6 weeks is that's completely flattened out. We know money chases returns. And so what's happened is that the money that chased those returns has now lost its way looking for returns here in the US. And maybe now the emerging markets are the beneficiaries of that. And it's sort of money is looking for a new place to go in the last 6 weeks, and the emerging markets are the beneficiaries. How long that lasts? Who knows?
Who knows?
I'm not in the forecasting game.
Also, we have seen, for instance, with the Mexican peso, lost a lot of value and has recovered a little bit. And now
recovering.
Yeah, so it seems that hopefully things are calm now, or calmer than at the beginning of the current US presidency. Which is very good news. So we want our neighbor from the south to remain a friend and a good neighbor. So that is probably good news.
Well, I like the way you said that. It's very nice sounding. However, if there's one thing I know in the emerging market space, and I've been doing this for 25 years, is that we always experience some kind of shock, some sort of volatility, some kind of unexpected outcome, whether it's geopolitical forces or monetary policy forces. There's always going to be something that makes it just that little bit more interesting.
You are very right.
But I like your idea for sure.
We want to encourage dialogue in these conversations. We want to build bridges, so that's the purpose. And we have also here with us, we always like to hear the views from students who are about to jump into the real world from the younger perspective. How do you see that, what is happening right now, Ross?
I think that there's a lot of kind of Armageddon type of scenarios when it comes to free trade and how the economy is going to change. But if you look at the actual facts as they stand today, not much really has changed. So yes, we have a Trump administration that's talking about changing NAFTA. But beyond that, the United States has free trade agreements with multiple Latin American countries, with multiple countries in Europe and in Africa and in Asia. None of that has even been mentioned by the Trump administration as on the table as being changed. It could, but there's no reason to think that it will. And as the news has been showing us, President Trump has a pretty full agenda in foreign policy already as it is. So the likelihood of that coming up to the top of his agenda is probably not very high. NAFTA may be renegotiated, but beyond that, I don't see much changing when it comes to U.S. free trade. At the same time, I would even argue that in spite of the rhetoric coming from the current administration, you're actually going to see increasing amounts of trade globally in the world economy, because China, for one, is making immense efforts to increase its trade portfolio with foreign countries in the free trade space. Furthermore, you have countries in Latin America, you have the Pacific Group, you have Mercosur, that are actually making more efforts, not less, let's say, amidst the Trump administration to increase their trade flows. So I'm not as pessimistic when it comes to the future of free trade in the world as it stands. I also agree with the professor about the monetary side, and this is where I find it extremely interesting when it comes to emerging markets. Because, and kind of linking into expected infrastructure spending and possibly to some degree increased tariffs from the side of the Trump administration, you may see some increase in interest rates in the future. I think most people under any pretense, including under the Taylor rule for the strict monetarist, would argue that it's long overdue. I think it will happen. That will increase capital flows into the US for investors looking for higher returns. The net impact, in addition to creating more volatility in emerging markets, in my opinion, is it's going to lead to emerging markets needing to actually be more responsible, which in the short term can be extremely tricky. In the long term can actually be better for them. So what I mean is, for example, import substitution. You're going to see countries that are going to have to find a way to stop importing as much to meet their capital spending needs and deficits. You're also going to see a need for these countries to have more fiscal discipline if they want to keep having access to the credit markets, which is increasingly important. And you're seeing this play out right now in South Africa, when the president recently sacked the finance minister, and immediately South Africa's credit rating went to junk status. And there's a complete fallout now as we speak going on with that. So I think that volatility, as the professor said, is the key word. You will continue to see that in both directions. But I think the picture is a lot more mixed than simply kind of a negative perspective that a lot of people are kind of giving to it simply because of the rhetoric coming out of the Trump administration.
There is a new kid in the block, of course, China. You have traveled extensively in China, you have written, you are an expert on China. How do you see China's role? So the economy is still at 10 trillion, so very distant from the 17 trillion of the US, but definitely China might in trade and investments now, as we've shown in the last EMI report, is tremendous. So how do you see China, who seems to be coming out as a champion of global trade and free trade, how do you see China changing the equation? And definitely in Latin America, where we have seen President Xi traveling and saying, don't worry, we are here, we are interested.
Yeah, so, this is for me.
Yes, for you.
You know, I definitely, I've always been, I've told you many, many times, I've always been for a long time very optimistic about China's prospects. Economic prospects, notwithstanding all of the challenges that they face, and they're multifold. That still stands. What I think your question is about is them as a country in the global economic system and representing a countervailing force for this renationalization that we're seeing in other pockets around the world, including in this country. And I see that is a bona fide, genuine, real possibility. We're already seeing China's influence permeating more intensely into LATAM, into Africa, through infrastructure, joint public-private partnership deals, very active there. And I see that there is nothing holding them back from continuing that, I think, for the next 5-10 years going forward. Nothing. We're even seeing now an uptick in their growth prospects. I don't know if you saw the latest numbers from the IMF World Bank forecasts have now ticked up their prospective growth numbers for China. So I see them playing this countervailing force that you described in the global economic system, even more so in the next 10 years, 5 years, than the last 5 and 10 years.
Yes, we had a panel here in Cornell on the subject, and Professor Lin from China said that we should expect more. As you say, remains to be seen, but definitely the power is there, and definitely in Latin America they are there. So another opinion, Ross, from your side, how do you see China?
Concerning China, I think that China has a direct national interest into expanding its trade with the entire world. Its economy right now is in a transition phase from going from manufacturing based to being service based, and I think that that's part of their overall kind of long-term strategy. You're seeing, because they have some restrictions on capital outflows, they have a different investment beta for their overseas investments, which makes the prospect of them investing in foreign markets in some cases far higher than it is for other countries. So my own prognosis with regards to China, provided that they don't change their capital flow restrictions, is that they're going to continually to increase their investment outside of their own country. And the thing that's difficult to prognosticate, but certainly is in play, is the let's say unreported amount of outflows that are coming under the table from China. I believe $50,000 is the maximum under Chinese law that one is allowed to send overseas, but I think by most estimates, any expert would argue that the actual amounts that are being invested in foreign places like Vancouver recently, which actually made adjustments to change the laws on investment in real estate there because of this, are far, far higher. Yeah. So these issues are certainly going to be in play. So I view, whether it's the Chinese government or individual investors, I think Chinese investment globally is only going to increase.
Yeah, I agree with both of you, for sure. They seem to be stopping the controls on capital flows. They were saying this, I think, is news from yesterday, but definitely they want to keep an eye on M&A activity because China has become the 5th biggest acquirer in the world last year, which is amazing. And then, just to close, we have here a person who is about to restart his career. So how do you see these changes affecting your career, your decisions on where to work, your decisions moving forward? You have been a very global student in the sense that you have worked in many emerging markets. So how do you see that going forward?
I think it's a bit of a paradox. I think on the one hand that one is going, especially with the nature of a transition economy to, let's say, what Peter Drucker called a knowledge worker-based economy, the need to have high-level technical skill sets will only increase in the future as the labor market changes. So independent of the current shifts globally, that part is not going to change. What will change, however, and what will be, for me, a challenge, and I think anybody else who's going into this market from Johnson or in any other top MBA program, will be the issue that you have to be more comfortable with uncertainty and you have to have more understanding of nuance. In other words, there certainly is a lot of ground to learn theory, but the nature of the way that the system is becoming not just bifurcated, but let's say multifurcated, where every single country, because of this kind of, let's say, somewhat trend to maybe become more nationalistic and less globalistic, although it's a question, as I mentioned before, the degree to which it'll happen. One is going to really need to become both a specialist and a generalist in emerging markets to be able to fully have a competitive advantage in the workplace. And that's kind of where I view my challenge.
Maybe a closing question. We in business schools have been champions, and we are champions of free trade and globalization. Do we need to change? Is this economic model going to be changed? Is there going to be a wishful thinking from us and wishful thinking from the politicians? Is going to change, or we are into a parenthesis?
Sure. I want to be, even before you finish your question, the answer is no. The force of globalization is like gravity. It is here, and it is here for good. What we'll see is ebbs and flows over the course of time as the political winds shift. I think we're in a really interesting time, and this is where people like Ross and the emerging markets institutes can really stand tall, because it's where we can really empower young people who are going to go into their next stage of their career to understand the nuances and the challenges and the infrastructure problems of doing business in these emerging markets. The challenges there are even that much greater because the threshold to make the case is that much higher. I think that's wonderful, but there's no way you can reverse course on gravity. This is force of globalization is there to be had. We need to be redoubling our efforts, if anything.
Thank you very much, Professor Andrew Karolyi, for your leadership. I learned a lot from you. And I
learned a lot from you.
Oh, that's so sweet. Thank you. You were the leader, champion, as you said, of the Institute here in Cornell, and we will always be grateful and very happy. And thank you, Ross, because you have
good
been
luck to you.
in
Thank you
my
very much,
fellow,
sir.
and good luck.